Hi, and good evening to all from Singapore. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Saiduddin Faridi, and on behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies here at the National University of Singapore, I would like to welcome you all to the ISAS International Conference on South Asia 2023. We will now be beginning with the fourth roundtable, and the roundtable is titled Everyday Politics of Identity and State in South Asia. On the panel today, we have with us Dr. Romit Chaudhary, Senior Lecturer, Erasmus University College, Dr. Amara Maqsood, Associate Professor, Social Anthropology at the University College London, and Dr. Neena Mahadev, Assistant Professor, Yale NUS College, Singapore. Today's session will be chaired by Dr. Ronojoy Sen, who is a Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead for Politics, Society, and Governance here at the Institute of South Asian Studies at NUS. Just a quick reminder for our audience that you may use the Q&A function to pose any questions that you may have during the course of the roundtable. And with that, I'll hand over the session to Dr. Sen. Thank you.
Thanks, Said. Very warm welcome to both the panelists and audience to Roundtable 4 of the ISAS International Conference on South Asia, which is on the theme of everyday experiences of the state in South Asia. As Said mentioned, the panel is titled Everyday Politics of Identity and the State in South Asia. In the earlier session, panelists have spoken about various aspects of the everyday experiences of the state, including everyday imaginations of authority, and just a little while ago on everyday politics of state delivery in South Asia. In this session, the panel intends to explore some of the following questions clustered around politics of identity and majoritarianism. So some of the questions are: how are identities of different communities constructed in response to or detached from state-led narratives on indigeneity, citizenship, and belonging? What explains the recent rise in populist and identity politics? How do we make sense of the shifts, which are sometimes often quite dramatic, in political ideologies of South Asian nations? To speak on these issues, we have an excellent panel. I shall invite the speakers in the order that they're listed in the program to speak for about 12 minutes or so, followed by a discussion and Q&A. So first, let me invite Dr. Romit Chaudhary of Erasmus University College, who will speak on homosocial masculinity in everyday law enforcement. It is great to welcome Romit, although virtually, back to NUS, where he did his PhD. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Ronojoy, Saiduddin, and Rajni for the opportunity to speak to you about my work. What I will be doing today is that I'd like to share with you some ethnographic glimpses of very mundane interactions between male public transport workers and traffic police in the city of Kolkata in India. Now, we know from feminist scholarship that the state is one of the main social institutions which organizes gendered power in virtually all social domains, including the city. Now, I'd like to describe to you some moments from my fieldwork to highlight how ideas of masculinity mediate the everyday state. And in particular, I would like to highlight for you very quotidian cooperative gestures between working class men who drive auto rickshaws and taxis in the city of Kolkata and traffic law enforcement officers in the city. Now, I have a couple of aims. One is to simply show how masculinity frames the everyday governance of mobility in cities. And secondly, I'd like to offer a very partial response to a question that continues to exercise feminist urban studies, and that is, how do state processes uphold patriarchal power in the city? Now, I'd like to share with you three moments from my fieldwork. One afternoon, I was traveling in an auto rickshaw in Calcutta, and in one major thoroughfare, the auto rickshaw slowed down because the driver wanted to pick up some more passengers. Now, as we were waiting, a traffic police officer walked up to us and started speaking to the driver. And he started reprimanding the driver that, Raja, how many times have I asked you not to wait here? You keep waiting here and I have no option but to find you. I mean, how long can this go on? The driver gets off from the vehicle, and he starts mock pleading with the police officer, saying that, "Sir, please don't find me today. This month is a really hard month. I've promised to take my wife to watch a film, and you know what kind of difficulty men fall into when they don't keep promises that they've made to their wives." And this led to the police officer breaking out into peal of laughter, and the driver also joined in, and there was this moment of camaraderie, which ended up with the police officer telling the driver, "Raja, okay, fine, I'm going to let you go this one time, but make sure that this doesn't happen again." Now, another moment that I'd like to share with you from my fieldwork, I did a fair bit of participant observation on in traffic training schools. So this is everyday, say, police workers, say, traffic law enforcement officers, taking training, conducting training sessions with auto rickshaw drivers, bus drivers, taxi drivers on how to drive better, how to make sure that they observe traffic norms. And something that kept recurring in these workshop sessions which I attended was that traffic police officers who were conducting these trainings would repeatedly tell drivers that they need to drive better, they need to observe traffic norms, because that would mean less fine, and that would mean more disposable income for them to dislodge their provider roles. So they would be able to, for instance, say, buy gifts for their wives, buy everyday essentials for their families, say, take their kids to different leisure activities if they had more disposable income. And this would be achieved if they observe traffic norms and therefore were fined less. And this is something that also they took on a certain kind of character also in the labor of everyday policing. So, for instance, I noticed one particular instance where an auto rickshaw driver, again, was being severely reprimanded by a traffic police officer for using very abusive verbal language with one passenger. And the language that the traffic police officer deployed was this, that he said that, "What would your daughter say? How would your daughter feel if she heard her father speaking this in this kind of a way?" So, say, auto rickshaw drivers, transport workers have to behave better because that would mean them being a better father to their children. Now, a third moment that I would like to share with you is, again, this is a traffic sergeant who shared with me in an in-depth interview which I did with him. And he was very emotional as he narrated this incident to me. He said that one very sultry afternoon in summer, it was so hot, it was so humid that suddenly he fell unconscious. And when he woke up, he found himself in the hospital bed. And he was surrounded by a range of taxi drivers whom he was familiar with, because he used to patrol one particular neighborhood, one particular thoroughfare especially. And he narrated to me that these drivers had rushed to him when he fell unconscious, took him to the hospital, contacted his colleagues so that he could be looked after, and stayed on in the hospital to ensure to figure out if he's recovering and how he's getting along in his recovery. And when the traffic sergeant tried to repay them, essentially compensate them for the lost hours of work, they refused to take this, and they said that, "So we know how you look after us. We know how you see us not just as people, but as family men. You know how difficult it is for us to provide for our families, and this is just a small gift that we can give you, a small gesture of support, of acknowledgement for the support that you show us." Now, I think these three vignettes are telling us a set of things about the everyday governance of mobility in cities, especially how ideas of masculinity inflect the everyday functioning of the state in city spaces. So the idea of homosociality has been a very important one in masculinity studies, but we don't really hear a great deal of it in discussions about state processes or even on scholarship on urban life. Now, in masculinity studies, the term homosociality usually demonstrates how sociabilities between men end up sustaining patriarchal social orders. So how friendly relations, mundane, friendly conversations between men end up defending the hegemonic ideals of masculinity. Now, the concept of trust, on the other hand, is typically taken to capture the moral orientation of the other. So when we trust, we assume that they will do what is morally right in any given situation. The idea of homosocial trust, I think, identifies a certain kind of moral vocabulary of masculinity by which men transact situational trust in the city. What which enables, so homosocial trust enables them to manage both the caprice of law, the fickleness of law, and the inherent unpredictability of city life as a community of strangers. Now, this kind of trust is homosocial in that it is predicated on a mutual recognition of at least three indices of masculinity. One is the morally exalted status of male breadwinning. Secondly, the city as the primary site for the achievement of this index of masculinity. And thirdly, patriarchal definitions of men's roles within the heteronormative family. We saw, for instance, instances of the good father playing out in how governance, how mobility is being governed in the city. Now, in the vignettes which are shared, we see that homosocial trust between men is a major structuring principle of everyday law enforcement in the city, in the sense that it guides, this kind of homosocial trust guides notions of what comprises good police work and what falls under bad policing practices. It also opens avenues for marginalized men, for working class men, to negotiate a very situational right to labor in the city. Now, at the same time, homosocial trust reproduces the city as a patriarchal space. And this is because it legitimizes the city as a site of hegemonic masculine performances. So homosocial trust in the context of everyday law enforcement ends up heightening women's sense of being out of place in the outdoors, in the urban outdoors. It emboldens everyday state practices to hinder women's access to public spaces. So what the emphasis on trust between men draws thought to is the masculinist collaborative logics through which urban policing maintains the city as a space of patriarchal power. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Romit. You've actually kept very well within the time limits. Next, can I ask Dr. Amara Maksul? And she'll be speaking on invisibility as ethic amongst Hindus in Pakistan. Please, Amara.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the organizers for inviting me to this talk, to this roundtable. I'm going to talk very briefly about the use and invisibility actually used amongst Hindus in Pakistan as an analytic to talk about how religious minorities survive, the rise of or the enduring presence of right-wing groups or majoritarian or populist politics. And I want to foreground a little bit why I want to talk about invisibility in this fashion. My recent work part of a broader European Research Council project, has focused on interreligious interactions in places where secularism is not a norm. And my particular focus has been looking at the lives of upwardly mobile Hindus in Karachi, which is a 25 million people large megapolis in Pakistan, but also part of the province of Sindh, which is significant because although Hindus form 2% of Pakistan's overall population, 7% of the 96% of the population lives in Sindh. And so actually, when you look at the population demographics of the province of Sindh, which includes Karachi, 7% of the population is Hindu, which means that they're politically significant, forming a dominant minority in small towns and villages, and in fact, a majority of 51% in some regions. And I'll come back to this point about them being politically significant. And what I have noticed in this field work, which I want to draw upon today, is how invisibility is part of how you conduct yourself as a person of a religious minority, to the point that often in cases to be a good citizen, to be a good Hindu, to be a good even Hindu family man, a responsible person, is linked to conducting yourself with discretion and invisibility in the public sphere. So invisibility comes up as this ethnographically important point, right? At the same time, I think what I have noticed is that invisibility is deployed across the Hindu population that I have come to work with. But it varies, or it's deployed differently across classes. And I want to talk a little bit about how the way in which invisibility is deployed differs across classes, which is not to say that all Hindus don't face discrimination, but how they respond to it is different. And what it kind of, I want to really focus upon is that how the contours of discrimination and how you respond to that discrimination vary across class, which overlaps with caste, talked about in Pakistan more in relation to community. And I think it's an important rejoinder academically for us to think in this way, because it moves us away from thinking about primordial differences of religion, right? And makes us think about tracing the intersectionalities of class and caste and gender that come to be recognized under the category of this broader religious difference. So with this spiel aside, let me just provide you a little bit more ethnographic context of what I mean about how invisibility differs across classes. In Sindh, for many years, the dominant voice of the Hindu minority has come from upper caste Hindu Sindhis who are Sindhi speaking. These are Hindu families, mostly Brahmin, but also coming from what you would call Lohana or Maharaj caste or community groups. That would be the upper two castes in Pakistan, who decided to stay in Pakistan at the time of partition, largely due to their vested economic but familiar interest in the region. And also it talks about the kind of historic relations and friendships that were there between their Muslim landlord counterparts, which were very much formed through the overlapping of business and social life through their involvement in agricultural trade and business, right? So there are these historic connections that have continued and are manifested in friendships between these Hindu families and Muslim landlords, many of them who've come to be dominant in Pakistan People's Party, which is the dominant ruling party in Sindh. And you see this effect in the way that post-partition invisibility amongst these groups plays out, is particularly in relation to how interests of this particular group are forwarded through back channel politics and relies very much not on making public displays of asking for rights or demanding rights, but utilizing these friendships that have existed, often which come across in conversations that I have seen ethnographically through jokes, for instance, right? And so ISAS, who used to be the leader of the Pakistan People's Party after the death of his wife, Benazir Bhutto, has long-lasting friendships with his Hindu friends that come from the region that he had grown up in. And often, the joke is that when Zardari is in jail, the dal that comes to his house comes from Hari Ram Kishori Ral's house, because that's the dal that he's used to having, who's a famous Hindu politician in Sindh. But the reason I kind of highlight these jokes about these friendships and so on is that what they highlight inside is that in the kind of larger populist framing of Pakistan and the way that politics can often involve the presence of right-wing parties that have immense street power, the best way to conduct politics and to ask for rights is to use these back channels, right? And to be invisible. And that is not something that comes up just for Hindu groups, by the way. Often lawyers who are fighting blasphemy cases for all religious minorities say that actually bringing in, highlighting an event on social media might seem really a great idea in terms of getting people to recognize what's going on. But it also means that it allows right-wing parties to use their street power to come out on the streets and make it into a big political issue. Whereas actually, if we kind of just hid behind the scenes, we could have gotten this particular issue resolved. And so this kind of back channel politics is present in talking about the way that blasphemy cases against Hindus are handled, but also about smaller rights, about whether roads should be constructed around famous or landmark religious temples that or mandirs in Karachi or in other places in Sindh. And so the focus entirely is that rather than going out to the public, you speak through your friendships and connections, which obviously talks about a certain kind of privilege, which I will bring up later. And this invisibility in public life means that you're not very active on social media, for instance. You're not very active in any kind of position that will give you public reclaim. So, for instance, you would have Hindus who work as corporate lawyers or who work in very senior positions within law and are very respected within urban branches, but would never stand for elections to be part of a union or to be part of a tribunal for laws, which again, not try to draw public attention to yourself. And I think what this means then is that while there is hesitance to be involved in public life, this also means that there's availability for these people or for these groups of people to enjoy freedom of speech within the liberal secular circles that are more part of Pakistan's private sphere, right? Which matches an overall shift that Arif Hassan had described in the 1980s with the rise of Zia's populism in Pakistan, that liberal elite groups were able to recede to the private sphere where they were able to live and enjoy particular kinds of freedoms, but not dominate public life in any way. And I think many of these Hindu groups have followed the same kind of strategy of invisibility, although to a much larger extent, given that they're overall more vulnerable than, say, other elite Hindu groups. And I think this differs very much for the kind of physical invisibility that I find amongst lower caste groups that I've been working with, or groups that would in Indian politics be cast more as untouchables or Dalits, but the term that much is not used in Pakistan, although they're talked about non-caste Hindus, right? And in the last 20 years, what we have seen in Pakistan is that certain non-caste Hindu groups, particularly the Meghbar and Bighirs, largely through utilizing government scholarships or utilizing the government quota system for Sindhis, which is then taken up by non-religious, taken up by minorities such as Hindus, to come up and enjoy a certain kind of socioeconomic mobility that was not available to them 20 years later, entirely through utilizing the kind of mismatched, fractured public utility system that exists within Pakistan, or particularly in Sindh, where because Hindus are a significant religious minority, have been able to use. And what we find about the invisibility amongst these groups is the exact opposite, that they are very active on social media, they're very active in utilizing all kinds of public online forums to talk about discrimination against them and the discrimination that they have faced, and also make it into activism issues around issues of forced marriage and blasphemy, but at the same time keep a very low profile in their everyday dealings. And I want to talk a little bit about this low profile in everyday dealings and how I want to contrast it. And because this is a group that has largely come up through the state sector, they do not enjoy the ability to retreat into the private sphere to be able to enjoy the freedom of speech or be able to display their identity and their opinions in a particular way. And so they have to be very, very careful in their everyday dealings, right? Which means that so all of this kind of Twitter activism and social media that I was talking about, a lot of them would not use their real names, or would not use pictures on their Twitter or their X accounts. And all of this is there to afford them a certain kind of invisibility in their daily lives. And in their daily lives, it would also mean invisibility to the point of, if you're going into a new area or if you're going into a new office where you're not likely to go again, you'd introduce yourself through a Muslim alias name, right? Something that upper caste Hindus would never have to do. And that's just a way in which you kind of gauge the setting that you're around, whether then to reveal yourself. And so what I find mostly in my fieldwork is that groups that have to deal or have to engage with the public sector, with the state on an everyday level, have to be very cautious in how they display their identity in these everyday settings. But in places where they can be a step removed virtually, they are able to exercise or enjoy a certain amount of visibility, which I think differs quite a lot from upper caste Hindus who can enjoy the safe spaces of the private sphere, which are open to them because of their class position, but will not display a very public identity in other forums, for instance, because it would hurt the kind of privileges that are available to them through back channel politics. So my my overall idea in talking about invisibility in this way is for us to see that how, although discrimination on the basis of religion might look same from the outside, the way that it's experienced is very different in relation to your relationship with the state, but then also how you might use the same coping strategy, but in completely different ways. And I think this points towards the overall ways in which the intersectionalities of class and gender and locality come into play when religious difference is constructed, and how you deal with the majority politics of the state. I'll just stop here for now. And hopefully we can return to these ideas in our questions.
Thank you, Amara. And finally, we turn to Dr. Neena Mahadev of the Yale NUS College. I think she's the only one amongst the panelists currently located in Singapore, and she will be speaking on public religion in Sri Lanka and how various religious communities have used media to intervene in contemporary religious identity politics and make claims upon the state. Over to you, Neena.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sen, and to the organizers, and wonderful papers from the previous two panelists. My brief presentation is called Religion, Publicity, Populism, and Pluralism. It's based on my book, Karma and Grace, which is coming out next week, actually. The release is next week. And what I am interested in many ways, in a kind of resonance with what Dr. Amara has just talked to us about with respect to publicity, and visibility, and invisibility. My work is also engaged with similar sorts of issues. I'm looking at Buddhism and Christianity as public religions and how they star very often in the public sphere, and looking at majoritarian politics and minoritarian logics of religious propagation as they circulate in the public sphere. And what I want to draw our attention to is the way in which the neoliberal transformations that we find ourselves in today, since the 1970s, mass media platforms have extended the consumptive habits of religious revival. And what this has meant is that for Buddhists and Christians, modernist revival among Buddhists often involves ordinary commitments to propagating the Dharma, but also a range of temperate and intemperate political rhetoric about religious minorities. But similarly, the same can be said about the nature of born-again forms of evangelical Christian and Pentecostalist rhetoric that is usually propagated in the context of churches, but also sometimes private evangelical networks that are not necessarily available to the broader public because of the way in which Sri Lanka has structured its televisual and mediatic channels. So what I'm interested in is how this aspirational rhetoric of Christian evangelism sits uncomfortably in the public sphere with a majoritarian politics. So I focused on the way that the kind of rhetoric and the polemical ways of religious propagation are not always so careful with respect to concerns about religious harmony. And I detail the way in which the idea of Christian publicity of their good news, the idea that Christ is a salvific figure, and what happens with this news, the so-called news, when it's propagated among subsets of a population who sharply resist it. And so I discussed the ways in which the leverage of state media by Buddhists and other networks and channels for religious propagation among Christians kind of create a split and a difference. And in some ways, this has a resonance with what Aravind Rajagopal has talked about in Politics After Television on Hindu nationalism and its intensification in the 90s, since the television series Ramayana was disseminated throughout India, and he argues that there is a way in which that although there was a unified messaging on the part of many of the promoters of the program, it necessarily entered into a split public, a public that was split by, in the context of India, caste, class, religion, language. And in Sri Lanka too, there's a different way in which there's a split, and this can be seen in the way in which religious channeling has worked in the context of Sri Lanka. So, for example, now, while I'll hold off on the example for a moment, but in the constitution of Sri Lanka, there has been an emphasis upon giving Buddhism the foremost place. Those of you who are familiar with Sri Lanka and Sri Lankan politics may be familiar with this. So it's not entirely a secular constitution, but it has a privileging of Buddhism and the need to. It emphasizes the need to protect the Buddhist majority and the inheritances of Buddhism. At the same time, there are minor provisions for religious conversion and freedom of religious expression and religious choice. But there are oscillating ways in which this gets reinforced by political authorities in Sri Lanka. So when Mahinda Rajapaksa, before and after the war, at the end of the war, he was often treated at the end of the wars because he consolidated a victory against the LTT from the point of view of the majoritarian state. He was seen as a symbolic sovereign, as having a kind of encompassing power to preserve Buddhism that was extolled by Buddhist revivalists, monks, and lay people. And in a way, he used that positioning to try to consolidate the sense that it is a Buddhist public, but also make provisions, especially for the Catholic minority. And he did this partly because of his Catholic wife and the way in which that there are there's an oscillating degree of enforcement and catering to this, attempting to consolidate a vote, a majoritarian vote, while at the same time he was doing so when it was publicly and politically expedient to do so after the war. He used the Catholic majority position among other Christians as a way to consolidate his power. At the same time, to reiterate that kind of consolidation of the consumptive habits of religious revival, it's important to note that Sri Lanka's first homegrown television broadcasting network was launched in 1979. And since then, private and state-backed channels have existed alongside one another. So mainstream television programmers have been compelled to abide by Sinhala Buddhist majoritarian interests, or otherwise to produce secular content. And so Sinhala television news media segments have often spotlighted conflicts, and telecasters are often narrate vernacular news segments on these Buddhist Christian altercations in a way that intentionally undercuts the possibility that Sinhala Buddhists might become positively attuned to the Christian good news, right? What is characterized in Sinhala as the Subha Arantia, the good news. But so comparing that variegated sense of the public, that the viewership to which this is received, what becomes clear is that there's a responsiveness between Buddhist networks and platforms and Christian ones. So, for example, in 2007, the Colombo-based vernacular news channel, a religious channel, The Buddhist, was launched from studios headquartered at a Buddhist temple in the capital of Colombo. And so, endorsing the endeavor, then President Mahinda Rajapaksa extolled the network's efforts to propagate the Dharma through modern mass media by likening the work of that channel of the network to the meritorious Buddhist monk Mahinda Thero, the singular emissary from the Mauryan Empire who introduced Buddhism to what is now Sri Lanka by converting King Devanampittisa during the 3rd century BCE. So at this launch event, Rajapaksa reported that under his guidance, the Ministry of Religion allocated a great sum of money to finance the endeavor, to nurture the nation's spiritual development in concert with economic development. And the monks who led this Buddhist channel, this television network initiative, overtly endorsed Rajapaksa's agenda for economic development, and implicitly, too, for his broader promises to end the civil war through military means rather than through a negotiated peace accord. That same year, 2007, cable providers in Sri Lanka introduced God TV, the tele-evangelical network, as an opt-in channel available to subscribers. So a Sunday sermon broadcast, and some of my ethnographic observations, I found this to be the case, that a Sunday sermon broadcast on God TV satellite channel reached the Colombo home, where normally a woman employed as a domestic worker, she appeared to be transfixed by the broadcast, and the songs and sermon emanated from the high-definition television captured her full attention. Since the family that employed her was out that morning, she facilitated my hunt for an apartment. But she opened the door and promptly returned to her station in front of the television and ignored our lingering presence after we viewed the apartment. The camera, as shown on the television, panned in to the face of an Indian tele-evangelist who extolled the importance of making exclusivist religious commitments, a born-again commitment. And so, beaming as the sermon turned into song, normally raised her hands to the screen to receive the Holy Spirit. And so she closed her eyes and quietly sang along. In their religious rhetoric, born-again Christian forms, somewhat similar to Buddhist nationalism, do seek to consolidate exclusivist religious commitments. But how this circulates in the religious public is quite distinctive. And as I mentioned, there is a kind of split public that we see in the context of Sri Lanka. There's a rhetoric and a discourse of religious persecution among minorities, alongside of an attempt to evangelize, as against Buddhists, sometimes violent anti-Christian rhetoric and occasional attempts to ban and block the growth of new churches. I start out by, I got interested in this project precisely because it was brought to my attention that Buddhists were trying to Buddhist monks were actively trying to revive Buddhism while they were trying to block what they deemed to be unethical conversions by using legislation to block the growth of new churches. And that legislation was modeled after that passed in several Indian states, but it was never passed, thankfully for the sake of religious pluralism, and because of the various mitigating efforts that Catholics and other majority groups within the broader Christian minority were seeking to establish. I would also like to just end by saying that what is made plain through more granular attention, ethnographic attention, to interreligious relationships is that occasionally Christians and Buddhists undertake complex negotiations to ensure social peace across religious divides. And in their proximity, Buddhists and Christians cross certain boundaries of religious identity in the everyday spheres, producing a complex of social and cultural and religious compositions. I show how between Buddhist and Christians, wives and husbands, parents and children, siblings and in-laws, friends and neighbors, macro level political antagonisms over religion are managed through quotidian negotiations. So otherwise put, neither absolute exclusivity nor radical pluralism are evident within these socially proximate interchanges. And I argue that what I call a multi-cameral approach, one that is situated within both communities and between the two kinds of communities, can illuminate those kinds of negotiations in the everyday sphere of religion. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. I think we have a three very diverse but rich set of presentations from three, again, very different locales in India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. We already have a few questions from the audience coming in, and I'll encourage more members of the audience to key in their questions in the Q&A box. So before I turn to the audience, maybe to set the ball rolling, I'll maybe direct a question each to each of the presenters. So maybe I'll start off with Romit, and of course he's presented on a locale which is also quite familiar for me, since I also was born and raised in Kolkata. So I had a quick question on so you give some fascinating insights into interactions between the auto rickshaw drivers and the sort of enforcers of law, the police sergeants, etc. And you drew certain conclusions on the imposition of masculinity. But could you also sort of, in your research, did you sort of come across interactions between, say, the auto drivers and, say, women commuters, or interactions between the enforcers of law, like the police sergeant or constable, and women commuters? Could you sort of shed some light on that and how that sort of plays into your larger conclusions?
Should I answer right away, Ranujay, or are we collecting?
Yeah, maybe, that might work. Why don't you respond?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so of course, I mean, thank you, Ranujay, for the question. There's, of course, a lot to be said about how women respond to both traffic police and to transport workers, and how they react to the presence of women. I mean, one example that I can give you is how, again, certain family ideologies play into the interactions between these working class male transport workers, operators of public vehicles, and women, middle class women passengers. So, for instance, I mean, one example that I can think of is often middle class passengers, including women, will complain about bad driving, about unruly driving on behalf of both taxi drivers and auto rickshaw drivers. So on one occasion, I noticed that a young middle class woman restrained a driver who was speeding by sort of gently telling him, brother, have you been possessed by Superman? So by ironically invoking the kind of heroic masculinity of a very well-known fictional character, it's possible for young middle class women passengers to rein in wayward drivers. And this is something that drivers are quite willing to accede to. Again, I noticed an elderly middle class woman passenger sort of restraining a driver who was honking furiously, apparently for no reason, by saying, child, why are you honking unnecessarily? Is this really needed? And then the driver might turn around and smile and stop what he's doing. So by using this kind of maternal vocabulary, it's then possible for middle class women passengers to correct the improper behavior of working class men in the city. So this is just one kind of interaction that I observed. I'm happy to elaborate more if you have time.
Right. We can come back to that if there are sort of further questions on that. Could I now direct a question to Amara, and you talked eloquently about the strategy of invisibility, which is used by the sort of sizable Hindu minority in Sindh and Karachi, and you did mention briefly forced marriages, blasphemy. So my question is, how does this strategy of invisibility work during sort of moments of crisis, such as forced marriages, blasphemy, or maybe something else that is directed against the minority. Could you sort of elaborate on that?
Yes. So I think, thank you for this question. So I think precisely forced marriages, blasphemy, these are moments of activism, right? And they also bring what could be long suffering everyday forms of discrimination that then find outlet in this one moment of crisis. So when people are talking about forced marriages, they're not just talking about forced marriages, but they're also talking about a long ranging everyday suffering that takes place. But precisely, it's exactly in these moments that I notice a difference. And so, for instance, things like the institutions that are there for advocacy for Hindu minorities that are led by upper caste Hindus would often say we should not go on Twitter or use social media to talk about these incidents, because if, for instance, and I mean, we don't have time to talk about this, but I would perhaps in some other question go into what constitutes a forced marriage and how it's talked about from a community. Is that, for instance, if a forced marriage involves the abduction or the forcible conversion of a Hindu girl to Islam and then being married off to a Muslim man, these upper caste advocacy groups would say we can use back channel politics to try to retrieve this girl. Whereas if we were to use social media or use public forms of activism, or also to go to the courts, which would then make it a lot more public, then it would involve the religious rights coming into the picture, and particularly laws in Pakistan around conversion that once someone has converted to Islam, they cannot convert back or they're liable to be killed. And so precisely to avoid it becoming a spectacle in a public domain, we will use these back channel politics, which obviously are available for these upper caste advocacy groups, but at the same time are often used particularly for them as well, right? So this is not something that would be available to lower caste or non-caste Hindus who would then like to use social media to talk about their plight more broadly.
Right. Thank you, Maran. I'll direct a question to Nina before we turn to the audience. I see some questions coming in. So Nina, you talked about the Buddhist and Christian networks and the tele-evangelists and the split public. How does Islam and its networks play into the story? Did you do any work on this?
Thank you for the question. Islam was not directly the focus of my research. However, it was as the kind of intensity around efforts to legislate against what they were calling unethical conversions, that was sort of shot down in part because Rajapaksa's alliances with the Catholic Church for a time. But immediately after that, there was an intensification of anti-Muslim violence by Buddhists who were agitating to ban halal sacrifice and halal labeling. So there was a kind of majoritarian, the kind of essentially the target had shifted. There was a re-articulation of conflict, right? In the post-war era, from focusing on the ethnic Tamils to then to the Christians and then to the Muslims. So that sort of has shifted course over time. And I kind of passively, it's not the focus of the book as such, but I have looked at a bit about how those terms, how those things have been re-articulating and shifting. Of course, then much of that anti-Muslim rhetoric and agitation, they were claiming that Muslims were making a business out of halal labeling and out of religious exclusivity in a way that was not native and natural to Sri Lanka, right? In different ways, both Buddhism and Christianity have been seen as being injected with muscular foreign influences, right? And so they bear that minoritization and the majoritarian discourse around minorities has that in common. But it has shifted, and of course, because of the more global concerns, and then in 2019, well after there was agitations by Buddhists against Muslims. There were the bombings of several churches and secular spaces that now has been exposed, is said to have been exposed to have been intentional work of government mismanagement and an opportunity to claim the need to securitize Sri Lanka in the post-war context, right? So it appears as if the Christian, anti-Christian rhetoric is just a blip in something much bigger and more oriented towards Muslims. But what I'm showing is how in the post-war context, when there was a great deal of humanitarian intervention from the West, there was a sort of analogy being made between Christian influence that was establishing a kind of Western Christian modernist sensibility that has a resonance with Western colonial, neo-colonial tendencies of humanity. So there's a convergence of this. So I'm really looking at the contingencies of that in the post-war moment and post-tsunami moment, but also the fact of the growth, the real tangible growth of new churches that isn't fully reported, that the demographics don't really get at, right? There's certainly the fear of small numbers, as Arjun Mapadare talks about it, but what I try to do is try to give a nuanced take on the religious discourses, the mutually incendiary discourses that are being propagated in public and private spheres, right?
Right. Thanks, Nina. So let me now turn to some of the questions that have been coming in from the audience, and maybe they are visible to you, but I'll sort of read it and direct it to whichever speaker it's meant for. So there's a question for Romit that has come in, and the question is, and I'm reading it. It's curious. Curious to know your thoughts on how hypermasculine city spaces are navigated across class or the intersections of these gendered spaces with class. Does that, do you want to address that?
Sure. Again, thank you for the question. And there's a lot to be said about how class inflects with questions of masculinity. I guess one instance, one expression of this would be that for a lot of these middle class passengers of auto-rickshaws and taxis, in a general sense, the comportment of these drivers, so bodily gestures, mannerisms, styles of clothing, manner of speaking, so on and so forth, are considered to be incongruous with the image of the global city that middle-class passengers aspire for. So what they routinely express, and much of the conflict that plays out between these working-class male drivers and middle-class passengers, often could be explained by contesting views of what the good city looks like. So a lot of the middle-class passengers will allege that their behavior, their manner of speaking, their in a general sense comportment, bring kind of a bad reputation to the city. So what the middle class passengers want is that they want access to the labor of these working class men, but they don't want these working class men to be visible. So in a sense, I guess this connects to the idea of invisibility that Amara mentioned you mentioned in your presentation. So that's one instance of class playing out in these city spaces. But perhaps it's also important to briefly mention that class is also shot through by ethnic contestation. So I've been speaking about the auto rickshaw driver, but in the case of the taxi driver, the disrepute that has gathered around the figure of the taxi driver in Calcutta also has to do with how in recent decades, the primarily Sikh population who would ordinarily supply the people to do taxi driving has been replaced by migrants from rural Bihar. And while Sikh masculinity is seen as reliable, as honest, as hardworking, the Bihari male migrant is seen as uncouth, uncivilized, so on and so forth. So this is also in the middle class imagination. So that is also how class is inflected by ethnic contestations in city spaces.
Right. And I was moving to the other question. I see a question that's somewhat related. You talked about the the perception that the more recent sort of taxi drivers are uncouth, and there's a question that has just come in, which talks about the behavioral pattern of auto rickshaw drivers and labels them. I'm quoting the member of the audience as uncouth and indecent, and this oftentimes triggers trouble. Again, so the question is, does this behavior have anything to do with their class background?
I'm sorry, Ronji, I'm just looking at the question.
Yeah, that's, I think, probably one of the last questions, 622, on the behavioral pattern of auto rickshaw drivers, and calling them, I don't know whether you agree with, as uncouth and indecent.
Right, absolutely. I think, I mean, typically in the middle class imagination, traffic police is seen as being hand in glove with these taxi drivers and auto rickshaw drivers. And what I try to show through my ethnography is that there is a way in which these traffic police officers and transport workers collaborate, but it's not really quite in the same way that in the middle class imagination is seen as being sort of hand in glove. The police being in cahoots with taxi drivers and auto rickshaw drivers. What rather is happening is that the ideology of male breadwinning, the impetus that patriarchal cultures place on men to provide for their families is really providing the ground which acts of empathy transpires between these two groups, which are ordinarily in conflict with one another. So yes, there are instances in which, say, traffic police will see these drivers as uncouth, as uncivilized. But again, the state is not entirely separate from society. So traffic constables, especially on the lower rungs of the police hierarchy, also share similar social demographics that these auto rickshaw drivers and taxi drivers are occupying. So that opens up places, avenues for empathy between traffic police and the transport workers. So yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting.
If it's okay, can I just add in to what was being discussed just now? Because I think that's what I found really interesting about your presentation, Romit, that I was thinking that, what are the ways in which working class, bodily gesture, embodied ways of being working class have to be disciplined to be able to be present in the city, right? And I think I found it really interesting what you were saying about homosocial trust, that on the one hand, it allows working class men to be able to sustain a livelihood in the city. But on the other hand, it means that they have to present themselves in ways that cater to the larger patriarchal middle class discourse of to be a good family man, right? And I think some of the answers that you were giving just now about then what it means for how you interact with passengers, I wondered what are the mediating ways or mediating gestures that working class auto rickshaw drivers have to bring in to be more palatable to passengers, right? And I was thinking about it from the perspective of Pakistan, where increasingly auto rickshaw drivers or taxi drivers would address any woman as ma'am, right? And so you've kind of displaced the kind of sister or child or whatever other ways that were there to create some kind of a cross-gender bond through this very kind of professional use of the word ma'am to address any woman. And I thought about it also that it links to what you were saying about the passenger's imagination of belonging to the good global city, right? So I wondered what were the other kind of mediating, ways in which you mediate your working classness to be more palatable.
Right. Do you want to respond to that, Romit? Or
absolutely, thank you, Amora, for that comment. You're absolutely right. But something that I also noticed is that yes, while this aspiration to be a global city is certainly dominant among the middle classes, there is a way in which, precisely because the auto rickshaw in Calcutta is primarily a neighborhood mode of transport, there are in fact other social relations that play out, that encapsulate both the passenger and the driver. So, for instance, I mean, any kind of empathetic gesture is at the end of the day an act in translation. So oftentimes, for instance, if there are, say, stories of tremendously severe conflict. So, for instance, say an auto rickshaw driver who has slapped, say, a middle-class passenger. One kind of reaction to this is, of course, to stigmatize the culture of the auto rickshaw driver, the culture of the taxi driver by calling him uncivilized and uncouth. But there is also an empathetic gesture that I often encountered among middle-class passengers. So, for instance, some would say that they are repeatedly disrespected. They are working so hard to earn for their families. So if passengers are disrespecting them, on the first occasion, they might turn a blind eye. On the second occasion, they might get really angry but not express the anger. But on the third occasion, is it really that outrageous that they take it out on passengers? So these are also logics that are coming from middle class passengers, which don't call for an effacement of working class identity. But what it does is that it's again strengthens even the moral justification for even violent act is based on the greater morality of breadwinning. That it's such a noble task that men are. This seems to be the mode of moral reasoning. That it's such a noble thing for men to provide for their families, and therefore we have to make exceptions, so on and so forth.
Right. Yeah, did you want to say something, Amar? No, okay. So I think there are a couple of questions for you. One which you might have answered online, but I'll just sort of repeat it. I'm not sure whether the larger audience is privy to that answer. So, one of the questions was, on, whether, Amar, your research has observed or, talked about how strategies of invisibility change when these individuals are in sort of less hostile environments, such as the West or in other parts of the region, or whether they adopt new strategies of invisibility. And there's another question which is somewhat related to the one that I had asked, which talks about Hindus in Pakistan, how they withstand state pressure, or when they're coerced into submitting to majoritarian practices. You want to sort of address those two?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I will just repeat the answer that I had given for what, are these invisibilizing strategies used all the time, or do they change when you're in less hostile circumstances? Yes. I mean, they change not just based on whether you're in less hostile circumstances, but also on ideas about familiarity. So if you're in, say, you start off in college where you feel this could be a hostile environment, but over the course of your degree, you realize that there are certain spaces in which you can be less invisible or you could be more invisible and so on. And definitely there is a sense of when you're moving abroad, you can leave behind some of these invisibilizing techniques. Although I had mentioned that, keep in mind, people are not just thinking about their own protection, but often about their family. And also thinking about their family in relation to not just the Muslim majority, but also the kind of Hindu community that might be governing their life worlds as well. And so one of the big things that people say about if they would move abroad and marry someone, say someone Hindu would marry someone Muslim, the question is not just about what would the Muslim community do to them back home, but also how their family might be treated by other Hindu members of their community. And so I think those relationships mean that this idea that you can break free completely from a hostile environment when you move abroad, doesn't really hold true in terms of these kind of sustaining relationships. But beyond that, I also want to say, and I didn't have time to talk about it in my presentation, but the broader ideal that comes out of it to conduct yourself at discretion, I feel that over the years has become a generally positive value that is talked about in, what it means to conduct yourself well, is to conduct yourself with discretion. And I think it maps on to certain kinds of ascetic religious sensibilities that are present in South Asian religions, Hinduism, in Buddhism, and Islam. And it's very interesting how this particular idea about being discreet or invisible, which is clearly coming from external pressures, is mapping onto those ascetic ideas. So it's also generally considered as a positive value, which might withhold whether you're in a hostile environment or not. the second question that's asked that I feel a certain amount of discomfort about how to answer it, because on the one hand, I feel that obviously there is state pressure and public pressure for Hindus to conform to Muslim majoritarian practices. On the other hand, what gets defined as Hindu and what gets defined as Muslim, I think, is a result of these pressures, right? And that there are overlapping categories in certain moments. And I'm thinking very much about the larger history of sharing sacred spaces, which was very much part of everyday religious life in Sindh, and which continues in certain ways in terms of the fact that certain Hindu families and communities have relationships with certain Muslim shrines, and vis-a-vis there are certain Hindu deities that are still respected, for instance, say in the truckers that go around Sindh who might ask for wishes of the deity. And so these are kind of overlapping practices that mean something to both religious communities. For instance, observing Muharram, the kind of wider love for Hussein that is present among certain Hindu communities, which I don't think we can very easily talk about in relation to, oh, this is happening because of state pressures. I think that there's a longer history of sharing across religious spaces for different reasons that is there. That said, of course, I think post-1970s in Pakistan, the broader pressure to conform to certain majoritarian Muslim practices is very much there. And keep in mind that it is there not just for non-Muslim minorities, but is also there for minority Muslim sects, right? For instance, it's there for Shias as well. It's there for Ismailis as well. The most amount of sort of the center of blasphemy accusations is actually not the non-Muslim minorities, but it's often Ahmadis, for instance, who have the most amount of blasphemy accusations against them. So just to say the pressure isn't there just for Hindus, but it's across the board to conform to certain kind of majoritarian practices. But the way that it is resisted or is countered is through these, I feel, alliances and small moments of solidarity that develop between Hindu and other Muslim minority groups. And to just give you, for instance, an example, this Hindu interlocutor was talking to me about their Muslim friend's father had died, and they were all going to go and offer condolences, and that also included going to the mosque to say the prayers that you say after the funeral prayers. And now my Hindu interlocutor felt that this friend of his was good enough of a friend that he wanted to go. And then when he went into the mosque, he suddenly felt like, oh, he can just stay back and not pray. But he suddenly felt that there were lots of eyes on him, right? And whether there's a certain kind of pressure for him to perform in a particular way. Or, I mean, he's like, nobody said that I should come pray, but I felt this pressure of being inside a mosque, all these eyes on me, how am I supposed to behave? And then he got the eyes, and so his friend was a Sunni Muslim, and this was a Sunni mosque that they were in. And he got the eye of this group of Shia Muslims who were in a corner, who were also not praying inside that Sunni mosque. And when they looked at each other, they kind of grinned and they kind of gestured, why don't you come over here and sit with us for now? Nothing was said about who's expecting whom to pray or where should you pray, but there was just this moment of solidarity for that moment that later might disappear. And so I think, and when thinking about how state pressure is negotiated, it's very important to think again about these cross-religious, interclass solidarities that appear and disappear, that allow you to withstand broader pressures that you might be feeling of the majoritarian state.
Right. Thanks, Amaya. There are a couple of questions for Nina. One, I think, which Nina has sort of typed the answer, but again, for the larger audience, maybe I'll repeat it. The question is on the parallels drawn between Buddhism and Catholicism in Sri Lanka, and whether your research focuses solely on Colombo, or did you expand upon broader intersectional characteristics based on geographic location, such as urban-rural divide, etc. And then there is another question that's
I think it asked if the anxieties about unethical conversions are still.
Yeah, right. You can read that, right? On unethical, I'm quoting within quotes, of unethical conversion Sri Lanka and the anxieties.
Right.
Yeah.
So thank you for those questions. What I would like to emphasize is that initially at the start of the anti-conversion politics and the discourses in the early 2000s, there was a broad sense that all Christianities were unified under the sign of the cross, and they were all painted, cut from the same cloth, and so a source of anxiety for Buddhists more generally. And that stemmed in part from the sense that there was a continuity with colonialism, and Buddhists were not necessarily making the differentiations. So Catholics very intensively lobbied to be considered distinct, not by in any kind of not by a political category or anything like that, but simply saying that we're against this legislation in part because we're a majority among Christians and we have a lot of commonality with Buddhists. But Pentecostals are so-called fundamentalists who don't abide by the same sensibilities that we are brethren religions, that we are cousin religions. So that way in which that was really emphasized, the difference, this stems back to old distinctions between Protestantism and Catholicism, but it can also be attributed to a different aesthetic sensibility about how religious propagation should work. So Pentecostals talk in tongues, and according to class orientation, and the rural-urban divide determines this as well, is that cosmopolitan Pentecostals do a kind of gentle talking in tongues that's not particularly exuberant and not particularly attention-getting, but they tend to be quite cosmopolitan and have a lot of economic and political clout in Colombo, and they tend to vote liberally and so forth. Among other communities of Pentecostals, those who are supposed to be attached to older forms of religion, there's a kind of spiritual warfare that is seen that needs to be take place to break them of demonic possession, right? And so there's a very exuberant form of religion at work, especially in rural places, but also suburban contexts, where it's not just talking in tongues. There's a kind of more ecstatic, exorcistic, and ecstatic form of religion. So on the basis of Catholics can say, first, we don't need to create new converts because we're an established religious community. Buddhists are brethren, and we don't engage in the kind of cacophonous exuberance. It's actually the words of the now cardinal, that Catholics don't engage in the cacophonous exuberance that Pentecostals do. But we also don't have a stake in trying to create new converts. We want to maintain our established religious community. So they were saying that they have this commonality with Buddhists that they can work with, and they're both fully within the fold of the nation in a way that some of the new Christian groups are not, right? And so that's a really important aspect of this. Additionally, that discussion of are the anxieties about unethical conversion still present? Absolutely. They kind of episodically emerge. Most recently, the evangelical pastor, there was a prayer hall that was demolished by a group of Buddhists. And again, the media winds up having some complicity in this. But that idea that the poor are being allured by charity and by the kind of accoutrements that well-heeled Christians can use to draw in Christians is something quite striking. And so what I argue in the book, one of the things that I argue in the book, is that there's a differential sensibility about religious giving classically. While Buddhist monks take alms from Buddhist devotees in exchange for merit and so forth, Christian pastors give charity, and so it's seen as, on the one hand, the Buddhists perceive that as a kind of unethical allurement, that material culture and charity is is a fetter upon the mind, and so that the mind is impinged upon. So Buddhist philosophy comes into this discussion as well, and a sensibility of how one has to abide by one's karmic inheritances to really achieve an overcoming of samsara, right? And meanwhile, evangelical Christians will sometimes say that Jesus is the shortest way to overcome samsara, and that we're offering a shortcut, right? And so there's also a discourse that suggests that Buddhist almsgiving has been, that Buddhism is a selfish religion because it requires relatively poor people to give alms to the Buddhist monks. So this logic, these kind of differential logics of religious giving and religious care, which are actually, if you look at them on their own, there's a great deal of care put forth in both forms of religion. But when they come together in this way, and it is seen that religious charity is being used to bring in new converts, all kinds of differential kind of conflictual basis for the material way in which religion is performed on the everyday level becomes a source of conflict and a claim of mutually incendiary and inflammatory claims that the other religion is selfish. So I see this kind of sparring constantly in public discourse, but also more privately.
Right. Thanks, Nina. So there are a few other questions which have come in, which I think are not directly related to the, the set of presentations that we heard today. But there's a specific one for Romit, which is an interesting one, where the question is, how do you look at recent steps by some state governments in India? And the latest is I guess, Karnataka, where the Congress made this an election promise, which has made transport on state buses free for women. So is this a way of reclaiming public spaces for women? And how has this changed gender interactions, if at all? Would you like to tackle
Right.
that?
Yeah. This is the light is going off on this question, so maybe that says something. Yeah, I mean, I certainly think of this as a very welcome step. I think it certainly shows a message that women have a right to the city. But again, I would say that this is really, one chapter in a larger book. I think even as we welcome this move, I mean, these kinds of public policies, we also have to direct our energies at ideas and everyday practices that routinely tie middle-class women to dwelling and stasis, and think of masculinity, think of footlooseness and mobility as a masculine virtue. And while on the one hand, I do welcome public transport within cities being made free or subsidized for women, I'd also be interested to know if similar policies are being directed at traveling to the city. We know that a lot of women from peri-urban areas travel every day to the city to labor in the city. So are those modes of conveyance also being subsidized? Is also something that I would very much be interested in seeing if there's any political leverage for that kind of policy intervention.
Right. I think we don't have too much time left. So there's one question which is directed to all three speakers or panelists. Very broad one, but maybe that might serve as a sort of summing up statement by each of you, if you so desire. And the question is, what differences do you see on majoritarian religious extremism / conservatism in India, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan? Of course, this is a very broad question, but maybe if you sort of use this as an entry to sort of make a quick summing up statement. So should I kind of go in reverse order? Nina, do you want to sort of address this?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. As I mentioned, there's this sense in Sri Lanka that these minority influences are actually backed by muscular international influences and injected, and so that these numbers are swelling, right? And I think that there's something, there's a long-standing sensibility in the context of Sri Lanka that conversions, unethical conversions or pragmatic conversions, even conversions that were for political gain or economic gain, have been present. And I think simply among majoritarian nationalist discourses, there's this really intensive sense, because it's a small island country, that it could be flooded out by minorities, right? So I think that there's a way in which that has been a long-standing concern. Scholars, historians have talked about Sri Lanka as being a crossroads for history and a movement, a hub for all kinds of movements, right? And at the same time, there's a way in which islands are constructed as insular places that are not accessible to outside, but in fact, there's all kinds of movement, right? So the way in which a majoritarian population needs to manage that, thinks about that, is pretty significant. The other last thing I will say is that Sri Lanka, because of its connections to the Theravadan world in Southeast Asia, there's incredible amount of kind of parity and similarity between what happens elsewhere in Southeast Asia and Sri Lanka. So even as we're comparing South Asia, I think there's a way in which there's that connection. For example, the way in which religious majorities are protected constitutionally, I think that can be seen throughout Theravadan states in Southeast. I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Nina. Could I turn to Amara? Do you want to sort of address very quickly this very broad question?
Yeah. I mean, I am mixed about whether to emphasize that there's a big difference between how majoritarian politics have worked out, because as Nina has mentioned, obviously the contours of them are quite different, given that geographically, historically, the connections are different. But at the same time, I mean, overall trends seem to be quite similar in the kind of rise of majoritarian right-wing politics, but also the use of religious symbolism in issues that previously would come into the domain of mainstream economic policies and so on, right? For instance, like social justice is talked about through an increasingly religious lens rather than being talked about as a particular democratic ideal. But one of the things that I think stands out, which might be different for Pakistan, particularly in this historical moment, is that populist and right-wing parties have never done well in free democratic elections, right? So whenever you look at Pakistan's history, whenever there have been free elections, religious right has done really badly and has not been able to have parliamentary strength. So where their strength historically has been through street power. And to use that street power to force leaders and democratic parties that are largely, I mean, I use the word secular in this very kind of gentle way, to bow down to religious pressure, right? And that, I think, is the way that politics has played out in Pakistan, in the way that it has pandered to majoritarian policies, not through these parties coming into power, but being able to exert their influence through street power. At the same time, I think what makes these politics in Pakistan interesting is that for religious minorities, particularly I think for Hindus, is that the way that they've had to work with mainstream political parties rather than to have political parties that represent their own interests, or to have minority parties, right? The way has been to always work with these mainstream parties. Sindh has had not only alliances with the Pakistan political parties, but there's a very long history of communism or left-wing activism in Sindh that included Hindus and Muslims both. And I think that's what perhaps in this particular historical moment makes Pakistan different in the way religious groups assert their pressure.
Right. Thanks, Amara. And may I finally turn to Rumit? I know this is somewhat removed from your area of research, but maybe one way to sort of tie this question to research is, you've of course talked about gender, you've talked about class. So does religion sort of sort of play a role in your research? Because of course, given that West Bengal and Kolkata have significant Muslim minority populations, so maybe you could sort of address it through that window if you so desire.
Yes, thank you, Ronajay, for that lead. I was as I was hearing this, reading this question, I'm of course reminded of the point that Amara made about the retreat of liberal ideas into the private sphere, and I think something similar might be happening in the context of Muslim public transport workers in Indian cities, certainly in Calcutta, which is where I did my study. A lot of Muslim auto rickshaw drivers, taxi drivers, for instance, I mean, they would tell me that. A range of traffic laws disallow them from practicing their religion. So, I mean, and not directly, but indirectly. So, for instance, the fact that there are insufficient parking bays, the fact that these public vehicles are constantly expected to be on the move, means that Muslim drivers are unable to practice roza or offer namaz because they don't know what to do with the vehicles at these times. So, in a way, the law-abiding citizen and practices of religious piety might be at odds in the context of traffic laws. So I think that's something that I certainly noticed in my ethnography.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Romit. I think we could have gone on for longer, but due to time constraints, we unfortunately have to draw this discussion to a close. May we express our thanks to all the speakers for committing their time, and to the members of the audience, most of whom I see have hung in there for the last 1.5 hours. So I'll formally call this session to a close and maybe hand over the floor to Saeed if he has any announcements to make about the sort of programs for tomorrow or anything else. Saeed?
Thank you, Dr. Sen, and thank you, everybody, for this really engaging session, and to the audience as well, as you've already covered. The only announcement is that with this session we come to a close for the conference for today, and we have 2 more sessions left tomorrow, and we look forward to seeing you there. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Bye.